Hello, everybody. This is Steve McKeon.
And this is Lupe Munoz. Welcome to the Leadership Exchange.
For our guest today, we've got new author Mark Reich joining us. And I say that term with some endearment, Mark, because I recognize from getting to know you a little bit, this has been on the list for a while. And congratulations on your book, Managing on Purpose. Looking forward to talking about that a little bit during the podcast. Give our guests a little bit of your background. So Mark spent about 23 years working at Toyota in a variety of roles right out of college, all the way through to helping Toyota launch in North America their manufacturing. And what's interesting is I've got to know Mark a little bit. Our paths with Toyota probably crossed a little bit as I spent several years early on in my career visiting some of the Toyota facilities that were startups here, all the way from Newmay to the Lexington, Kentucky facilities, and probably have crossed paths with people that you've known. Mark spent quite a bit of time working with the Toyota Supplier Support Center in a role there. But I think, Mark, what's really interesting, and I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself to our audience, just maybe start a little bit at the beginning, your background, how you ended up with Toyota, and then take us into a good story about why this Toyota experience and kind of what you're doing now with Lean Institute Enterprise has really led to you in the writing of this book.
Well, Stephen and Lupe, thank you for having me on. It's great to be here. As you said, I just published a book. The book, you said, is Managing on Purpose. It's to some extent a major bucket item for me. I graduated from college in the 80s. The U.S. economy wasn't doing so great, and the Japanese economy was booming. So a couple years out of college, I decided to go to Japan. I studied at a university there for graduate school. When I finished that program, it was for the Japanese language. When I finished that program, I had met my future wife, who's now been my wife for 37 years, and we wanted to stay in Japan a while. So I asked my professor if there were any companies that hired. And he said, well, we get calls sometimes. And so he called his secretary and said, Toyota just called us this morning. So I guess life, you stumble into opportunities and you make some. So I worked for 6 years for Toyota in Japan during an interesting time when they were launching the Lexus brand. I worked in product planning actually and did some work related to that. I ended up moving to the U.S. in 1994. And as you said, worked for the Toyota Supplier Support Center, where I learned the Toyota Production System. That was a group that Toyota set up to help its supply base and other companies implement TPS. I spent a fair amount of time there. And then I was transferred to the corporate strategy group, where I led for about 7 years our Hoshin Kanri process, which I guess we'll get into more about that, but that's what this book is about. So I really learned how Toyota does that well. I ended up leaving Toyota in 2011, and as you mentioned, came to the Lean Enterprise Institute. We're a nonprofit institute set up by a gentleman by the name of Jim Womack in 1997. He wrote an important book called The Machine That Changed the World about the Toyota production system and actually coined the term lean. And I realized companies started to call me, and because I had this experience in Toyota, particularly around corporate strategy and Hoshin Kanri, and they started to call me and ask if I'd come and look at how they do strategy. And I found a really big difference between what I had learned in Toyota and what I saw often in the world. And after helping a lot of organizations the last 7-8 years, I decided I'm not going to be able to help everybody. It might be helpful to write something down. So I wrote this book to share the thinking with a broader audience.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed your book. First of all, I encourage everyone to share in its knowledge. You talk about the story of True Motors, which the company finds itself in what I would say is a very familiar place, probably for a lot of companies, where, hey, things have been going well, but things are shifting. How do we recapture some of that momentum that we had, competitions, fears? But immediately in the book, you educated me on something I actually was not aware of, that the matrix wasn't really part of the initial concept of deployment strategy, and could you explain that a little bit more? So, because I do feel that sometimes people do get hung up on tools versus really the intent behind the tool.
To your question, that's partially the purpose of why I wrote this book. I learned some really powerful thinking around how, while I was in Toyota, And Toyota went through its own transformation at that point in time. So we were able to utilize Hoshin Kanri pretty effectively to help Toyota's organization, particularly in North America. Point you brought up about a lot of organizations are going through changes. And Toyota was going through huge changes at that time, growth and market was changing. And so out of that, I developed that case study for the book, really kind of related to somewhat my experience in Toyota, but also many organizations that I had collaborated with, where I found that some of the key elements of how we kind of define what our strategy should be, how we develop that, how we align leadership up and management up and down the organization to what the strategy should be and those objectives that we're going to focus on for the organization mid to long term, and then how we execute on that. And I would say engage people up and down the organization and develop capability of people were like critical items that I often saw like totally ignored. And one of the things I'd learned in when I was out in the field seeing other organizations, but one of the things I learned through application of the Toyota production system is that there can be a tendency for people to glom onto a tool because it seems like an easy thing to implement, when in fact this is a fairly complicated process. And while I was in Toyota, I never, to speak to some of your question about the X matrix, I never even saw an X matrix. I didn't know what it was. When I came out, I was asked by a gentleman named, you might know, Jeff Liker, who wrote The Toyota Way, and if I had ever seen that. He was writing a book about leadership. I'd never seen it. I did get exposure to it after I started to visit organizations, and I found that, as I commonly saw in the application of Toyota production, so there was too much focus on trying to digest and use that tool, and not enough focus on the learning and capabilities and alignment to leadership and how you execute effectively on the strategy. I wrote a little bit in my book. There's a sidebar about that. I decided not to focus on that tool or other tools specifically in the book. And I wrote a sidebar a little bit about tools. And, I'm a believer that if they serve a purpose and there's like fundamental thinking behind them, and they're easy and effective for people to use, then organizations should use them. The X matrix itself, I found, and this is through my exposure post-Toyota to various organizations. I know some organizations use it. My exposure is some organizations struggle with how to use it effectively because of the nature, a little bit the complexity of the tool itself. That draws the focus and attention away from like where the focus should be on development of people and alignment in the organization.
That's a great point. And just kind of my experience, I loved your book as well because it really brought me back to some of the initial learnings I had with TSSC. As we started to learn about Hoshin, I think going back to my young self, right, a new leader in that space, I grew up technically trained as a civil engineer, environmental sciences is the primary focus, remediation, that kind of stuff, moved into health and safety, and then all of a sudden was asked to take on a role in industrial engineering within an organization and never heard the term lean before, lean manufacturing. It was kind of interesting as I went through that. But the one thing that really stuck out at me in my journey is once we understood the importance of taking the time to learn about strategy planning and not have a big list, right? That companies tend to get a list of, 10, 15, sometimes 20 improvement priorities that you talk about in the book should really be part of daily management. But in some cases, companies aren't there yet. So I found that you can easily not just get hung up on the tool, but just really the clear focus that you point out in the book on what is important. So kind of walk us through your experience there, maybe the young Mark Reich back in the day at Toyota. How did you learn to be focused in and around strategy, whether it's the Hoshin process itself or just in general?
Thank you for that question. It is a challenge that many organizations face. So I can speak to my experience in Toyota, but also post-Toyota and what I've seen. In Toyota, my experience with Hoshin Kanri was mostly for the first half of my career as a team member or leader that had responsibility to participate in the process. And that participation in the process meant on an annual basis, or depending on what group you're in, your priority for the organization may align to the higher level priorities that were set for the company, and then you may be participating in some of that key activity. But also, one of the other parts I explain in the book is that Hoshin in Toyota was a fractal thing, meaning that, there was something developed at the corporate level, but there was also individual plants, individual departments in the organization established their own Hoshin. Now, it had, to a certain extent, if you had work that's connected to the higher level Hoshin, you had to have that on yours at the department level. But there were things that might be priorities for the department as well that they would maybe take on as their own priorities. So I think that was an important part of the thinking, in that, meaning that whole process of developing capability and building that tiered structure in the organization happens both top down and bottom up. So we want thinking from within the organization as well. So that was kind of the experience like I had through the course of like the first half of my career into it. I then was put in charge of it in Toyota, and I would say that was a timing in Toyota that was fairly challenging for us. It was really, and I'm speaking like a decade from like 1998 to like 2008, right before the major recession happened in 2008. That whole decade, Toyota tripled its growth of sales in North America and also tripled our production capacity. So really, adding all that capacity made it really challenging for Toyota to sustain its culture, because we were bringing in and promoting people a lot quicker than we traditionally had done, and sustain our management system. So, building that's kind of strong foundation that way, I think was really helpful for Toyota to sustain kind of its culture, and further strengthening our Hoshin process was helpful too. And when I left Toyota, I just found that most organizations tended to focus on those often way too many priorities, and there was no clear methodology to take what might have been a priority one year and transition that to daily management. Example that I often give is when Toyota launched the Prius in 1997. That was a brand new technology in the automotive industry, and a hybrid technology. And at the time, it was a Hoshin priority for Toyota, because they never sold a car like that. They never made a car like that. They never developed a car like that. But after a few years, that moved to daily management. Now you can get a hybrid on almost any Toyota vehicle. So that's something we manage on a daily basis. Hoshin should really be about what are those 3 to 5 things that an organization feels are its priorities and they can align to, and focus the organization on those things. At the most, I would say 3 to 5. In the book, the True Mowers, the case study has, they end up with 5 that the organization is focusing on.
One of the things that I wanted to get your insight on is an experience I've had in the last, I'd say, month. Number one, after reading your book, it really set the mind frame, way of thinking for me for these 2 events. So I was part of 2 exercises of strategy deployment, planning for our next fiscal year. And in both of those, I started to realize how different, because in one organization, the higher organization, this was the first or the second time we actually did it. And in I'll say the subordinate to the bigger organization, we'd been doing it probably for about 4 years. I started to realize how different the culture, in a positive way, was transforming throughout those years. And I started to try to connect it to the exercise that you talk about in the book around PDCA process, but also the catchball experience that leaders have. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what I observed related to how this affects the culture? Does it affect the culture, or does it reflect the culture of a team?
Oh, that's good. That's great question. You had several questions in there, actually. So I think I'm a big believer that leader behaviors and actions in the organization create the culture. It's not this. And so I think this can impact culture a lot in organizations if when done effectively. So your point about how you let me circle back to your question about catchball and PDCA. Those are two of the primary concepts. We were talking earlier about the question of let's not focus on the tool, let's focus on the thinking and the practice and the methodology. Those are two important concepts that are introduced and discussed in pretty much depth in the book and illustrated through the case study of true mowers and how they utilize those methodologies to help them. Maybe it's better to talk about first PDCA because the whole structure of the book is built around that structure. PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, for those who might not be familiar. This was a concept introduced to Japanese companies by Edward Deming back in the late 50s as they were coming out of World War II, trying to recover. And that's where the Japanese organizations like Toyota, Bridgestone was another one, really kind of adopted in the early 60s. Hoshin Kanri as a methodology to help really came out of the total quality management movement, TQM, which was using PDCA to improve product quality and manufacturing quality. But Toyota said, well, we need to improve everyone's quality across management. Out of that was kind of born this thinking that PDCA can be an effective methodology to build capability among management and build a structured kind of methodology to improve management ways. So the book is structured around how in the case study, how True Mowers develops their plan, how they go about like executing on that then, how do they reflect on what they did, and then how do they adjust and move things to daily management that they've accomplished. So that's an important part. In the context of that, catchball, the other part of your question is a key component. And I focus in the book I think it's really two different things. There's vertical catchball, which is really a development methodology in the organization. And there's horizontal catchball, which is really a methodology to build alignment of leadership across the organization. Vertical catchball is really what we were kind of just talking about a little bit ago, where, at the corporate level, maybe we develop 3 to 5 objectives. How those get broken down at different levels in the organization, all the way to frontline problem solving, so that leaders, middle managers, frontline managers know their responsibilities on how to support the corporate level, higher level objectives. And they know how to contribute to those, and they have input to those. That's kind of vertical catchball. And that's explained in the book in a pretty structured way. Horizontal catchball then, though, is actually what organizations, in my experience, with a lot of organizations, struggle much more with, and because organizations tend to be siloed. Once you've defined those 3 to 5 things, how do we determine who's responsible, and how do we determine what's expected, the plan, and how do we determine what other groups are responsible to support that, and ensure that there is good alignment and support across the organization.
Mark, you talked about this a little bit in your book as well, in terms of the ability for this planning, the Hoshin planning process, to develop team members at multiple levels within the organization. And that's been my experience with it as well, having learned it early in my career and going through a couple different really great organizations that had used the X Matrix. I think it was the Danaher tool. They were out consulting at the time and had adopted that. But the thing that I recognized, whether it was kind of that traditional Toyota approach or the products that Danaher had introduced to the companies I was with, is the ability to gather the group, right? So EHS, a lot of times the areas of my responsibility weren't necessarily at the forefront of change. And once we started planning with Hoshin, it wasn't an option anymore. Even if I didn't want to be, if I wanted to remain siloed, I couldn't. I had to be part of the process of looking at the strategies for the company, and then, where we play in that space or not, but just knowing that we've got to support the organization. So it really helps shape some clarity. And I guess as a young leader in any organization, let's take somebody now coming into the game, how can they increase their own knowledge in this space, in addition to your book, and maybe their organization is just starting to look at more structured strategic planning process like Hoshin, how can they help educate themselves?
Well, get my book. That would be a good start. But
Yeah, I was going to recommend that
let's just
myself.
talk about this first. The first part of what you said, which is really about how organizations putting together and who needs to be involved in this and how. One of the fundamental concepts we need to think about that's talked about in the book, and I'll speak to that example. Is an example in the book is that organizations, large and small, in whatever industry, they need to define what their corporate what the priorities are for the organization. Those are often irrespective of the functional silos that exist. In the case of the book, they're often, in fact, initiated by like the market forces or what the market they want to be in, where do they want to play, so to speak. And those factors don't relate to anybody who's in silo in any function in the specific function in the organization. They're the kind of overall corporate objectives. So the big challenge becomes, how do you take, in the case of the let's just use the example from the book. It's a lawnmower company. And this is a reality. Actually, when I wrote this case study more than 10 years ago, in reality, it's played out the same way. I mean, the lawnmower industry has moved from gasoline mowers, just like the car industry, to electric mowers. The book takes place at a point in time when a very well-established lawnmower company was struggling to develop a good electric mower. So that's the nature of the market. The company doesn't have control of that. The market's moving that. They have some control maybe, but the market's moving that way. But you can't develop and launch a mower that becomes one of their top priorities in the organization just through product development. I mean, they might be the lead on getting the mower launched because that's where the development happens, but you have to produce it. So you need manufacturing involved. You have to market and sell it. It's a brand new product. So they have to be involved. You may need new capabilities. So human resources might have to be involved with training, etc. Hoshin Kanri is an excellent methodology to delineate and break down those responsibilities and get alignment across the organization to how you help. And in the book, I introduce specific methodologies on defining who's going to support, who needs to support, for example, that product development initiative, and how they're going to provide specific support to it. So I introduced that. The other thing, to your point about new leaders or managers, I mean, this is a methodology for organizations. It's not a methodology for a frontline manager, to tell you the truth. And so leaders, functional leaders in the organization, I think, can find this learning helpful. And often I suggest, maybe to your point, Stephen, is that you don't need to, particularly for bigger organizations, don't try this across the whole company. I introduce that in the book. So if you're a new leader, let's say you have responsibility as a vice president of production. I mean, you can pilot that in your own function. Pilot the methodology. The methodology is applicable in any size organization or even a part of the organization. And so I would say, read through it, define what your priorities should be as a function, and then as a function, determine who's going to do that and what support you need from other groups. That whole process can be done, I think, and it is done in the middle of the organization, but also at the top of the organization.
You also point out in the book, and my own experiences as well, is that your first round of this is going to be clunky, right? It's not going to be perfect. But what's critical is building the approach and the dedication of time and resource. So the monthly meetings, the quarterly, semi-annual reviews, and then year over year, you get better at it. And so I think that was a really good thing you pointed out in your book, that, by year 3, some companies, maybe year 5, could be 6, it really becomes part of how you do business. So you start to get the chops. And then, what comes out of it is other opportunities for improvement in areas adjacent to Hoshin, like daily management, right? And so I like the concept around, I'm a systems thinker by, I guess, career. And so I saw, the magic start to happen in my own experience when companies were able to start doing this. And I always tell people, because they try to be perfect out of the gate, don't worry about that. We just need to get started and we're going to learn. This is also about, learning the process, learning to work together, to communicate. You may end up with 15 or 20 items on your list, but you recognize if you've done that, you need to get it down to a smaller group in order to be effective. And so I think, that's just my own experience with Hoshin, and I really like how you pointed that out in the book.
Much as I love what you talk about in the book, Mark, and the story that you tell, I'm going to disagree with your comment that you made a little bit earlier about like, hey, although this is not primarily for a frontline leader, there are so many things that you have interwoven into this story that really does apply to all leaders. In examples of what I see, I was going to ask you specifically about some of these components is like, you really talk about, at least from my perspective and my interpretation, some of the things that we talk about during this podcast, which is like a servant leader aspect of it, a leading by humility aspect of it, a sort of like being a good listener and asking great questions perspective. And those are all extremely valuable behaviors for even that frontline leader that creates that culture of being able to focus on, in this case, strategy and the deployment of it. But all of those things will benefit a team's culture. Even a supervisor on the front line, I think, if they can grasp some of those elements.
Yeah, Lupe, thank you for correcting me on that. You're right. I would say probably, and for your listeners, my comment could have been misinterpreted. I didn't mean this doesn't have a big impact on frontline leaders. It has a huge impact. My point was that if you're looking to get this started, and I think I say that in the book, it does require a certain level of leadership in the organization for it to have an impact. Because to Stephen's earlier point, it's kind of the way it was functioned in Toyota and the way I think it functions in good organizations, it's kind of an umbrella methodology that because it defines for the company, I mean, that's what strategy is kind of meant to be. For the organization, whether it's the whole company or a function, what their primary goals or objectives are and how they're going to go about trying to achieve those. So that requires I believe it requires the engagement of leadership, the involvement, the direct involvement and actually leadership of leadership to be able for that to be effective. One of the great outcomes of this, there's an article I wrote a long time ago that I refer to Hoshin Kanri and problem solving as like, and I refer to particularly A3 problem solving as like the muscle and the skeleton. I mean, to a certain extent, the Hoshin is the skeleton. It's the system in the body that or in the organization that hold things together and connects everything. But you need muscle. And you need muscle at the front line, like to your point, because that's where the problems exist. One of the difficulties of many strategies I see in organizations, they're like a poster on a wall. When in fact, like to achieve a vision or address a strategy, most of the gap that exists between where you want to go and where you are now exists in the problems in the work. It's not, like the example that's in the book that I just talked about of like launching an electric mower. Well, for the True Mowers company that's in the book is they had a prototype. They were struggling to get a production. Well, that's not something you just talk about in a conference room. There's reasons that they were struggling to get it from a prototype to production that relate specifically to the product development and the production work and how to build it. And I go into, to your point, Luke, I do go into depth about this is really meaningful to look at the frontline work. I want to share an example. So I worked in the restaurant industry fair amounts. I've applied this in many different industries. And restaurant industry was one. We were working in a seafood restaurant in the Boston area that applied this thinking. And we had a huge impact to that business by redesigning what the work of chefs do. I mean, the chef is probably one of the most, if in a good restaurant, the chef is probably one of the more important individuals on staff because they're the ones that actually make the quality food. Well, in this case, we found that the chefs were like, the work of chefs was like not effective. They were wasting a lot of time walking, the bending, reaching, and we redesigned that work. In the process of doing that, it actually greatly reduce the footprint of the kitchen itself. You realize you can apply TPS and lean thinking in any practice, in any industry. So we took out a lot of inventory. We made the work better. The ultimate outcome of that appeared on their Hoshin is because the kitchen design was smaller, they were actually able to open up a brand new concept of restaurant inside the restaurant. They call it fast and fresh, where you could come in and get like a seafood, I don't know if you heard, like poke bowl, for people for lunch that just wanted to come in, grab something quickly. This was traditionally a sit-down restaurant. Out of the redesign of the frontline work, which came from the Hoshin originally, to try to better attract customers, they were able to increase revenue in the restaurants, get a brand new customer base, and because they were able to redesign the kitchen. I spent a lot of time on that because I do believe that I try to reinforce in the book, and I'm glad you brought it up, Lupe. This is really about helping the work of the frontline people.
And I knew that's not what you were trying to say, Mark, but
I'm glad
I really, for me, the part of the genius of this book is there are so many of these things that aren't apparent, but they exist in this book. They jumped out at me as I was reading. I'm like, yes, this is this is a fantastic example. Here's another one that I want to call out because another great enriching topic that you do spend a little time talking about is the story tells about how developing people, and you've mentioned a little bit about capability. Developing people is part of your everyday as a leader, not just like a special project. And the process that you're talking about reinforces that throughout the book. And I think that's part of your genius in writing this is some of those subtle things that I think are very powerful.
Well, I'm not a genius. I just learned that in Toyota, and I appreciate every day that I had a chance to work in Toyota where that was really true, where development was part of the daily job and an expectation of management. One of the things that I point out just to be a little bit more explicit about, I mean, there's the daily mentoring, which we could spend a whole podcast on. One of the explicit things I don't ever see haven't seen outside of Toyota, that's where that Hoshin Kanri can be very effective for, is defining responsibilities and ownership of issues up and down the organization. Meaning, at the corporate level, we talked about those 3 to 5 objectives. Well, each one of those has an owner, and they're a leader of that objective. And just to start with that point, I mean, you can imagine if, as we talked about in our discussion, those aren't things that are limited to just one function. So the leader in the organization has to have the capability to do something I call lead by responsibility, not by authority. It's not because you've got to work across the organization and get consensus with others on what to do. And now, sometimes that requires intervention from your boss, but it's a great opportunity to see how effective do people how effective is this individual who's been given responsibility able to lead across the organization. That's one component. The second component, it clarifies, because as you break down the Hoshin in the organization, starting with at the top level and down into the functional level to the frontline work, as you say, people can own problems in the organization that relate to the higher level objectives. The ownership of those kind of problems, I think, is motivating for people, but it also it develops their capability. I mean, it's good to know, you work a lot of your life, probably we spend a third of our lives working at work. I think most people, I'm a glass half full guy, want to come to work knowing I know how I contribute to the betterment of the organization I work for. Hoshin Kanri is an excellent methodology to delineate that up and down the organization, and I think that's motivating. And it's done because people at each level own problems and become capable problem solvers. Now, just one last point about that. That's a whole component, and it's talked about in the book. That's a challenging part of Hoshin Kanri. You can't just. That's why I wanted to move away from the tools. You can't just put in place a tool and expect the organization's going to respond. You can put together a great back to my analogy of skeleton and muscle, you can put together a great Hoshin that kind of lays out the plan for everybody. But if the muscle of problem solving hasn't been built, you'll struggle. So you got to work on both.
Yeah, great points, Mark. As you were talking, I was thinking about, an organization that I'd worked with for a short time that really couldn't get it together in terms of strategic planning. So the owner of the company kept deferring responsibility to others without committing themselves to the process. And they asked me, I remember the conversation, he's like, "Hey, Steve, I've read all this stuff. I've been, a leader for X number of years in organizations. I just don't know why these guys don't get it." And it kind of goes back to some of the points in your book, and you touched on it, it takes the head of the organization, especially early on, to really be committed. If they can't set that example and they can't show their own commitment of time, resource, the mentoring, the system will fail, right? And so I think that's really an important point. One thing I'd like to just touch on next, Mark, with you is, as you look at kind of the new age of technology, right, and the people first centric approach of Toyota, how do you see technology, and you've seen it throughout your career, advancing in the company, and where does that fall into strategy planning, or does it fall into strategy planning right now with some of the organizations that you're working with?
Well, we're going through a pretty probably important point in history around all of knowledge management, where AI is probably going to help us a lot. I mean, it's already starting to show up, and the prospect of how it will be used is, I think, can be hugely beneficial. I haven't implemented myself these tools as they relate to Hoshin Kanri. I think that but I think they'll be very helpful. One of the things that's introduced in the book is there are inputs to Hoshin, and then there's the development of Hoshin, and then there's outputs. Often those inputs are, a lot of organizations don't have well documented. And inputs being like the market conditions and the market situation, the business environment currently, the input and feedback from team members, customers, and what their customers are saying about the business. Other inputs. Those kind of things are often in disparate systems. So being able to amalgamate that information more effectively and use it to consider what you should really develop is important. I have my own personal take on all this. I do worry a bit about, I just know I'm a long career now, and I know that I probably learn more, twice as much from the failures I had as the things that have gone well. And part of that requires penetrating and taking an initiative into unknown territory. And obviously there are key people that big thinkers that do that. But if, one of the great things about working with Toyota is you're kind of pushed to do that all the time on your own. And I think I hope that AI and other technologies don't take that away from us, because that struggle is so impactful on people's development, and taking that away, that idea of struggling through that process and finding a solution, and then finding maybe that didn't work so well and trying it again. That whole process is, I think, very important for people development.
Well said. We're getting close to the end of our episode here, Mark. First, really appreciate your insights. It's fantastic. The time's flown for me, which is a great indicator of the interest and the engagement of this topic with you. If you could, we always love to ask this ending question to our guests, and so please prepare yourself. If you had to go back in time and speak to yourself as a leader, what advice would you give yourself, and why that particular advice?
I think I can answer that pretty well. My nature, and it's been beneficial for me many times, but my nature is I'm not a real patient person, to tell you the truth. And so actually, coming into Toyota and in what is a very competitive industry, in probably the most competitive company in that industry, we have to recognize that Toyota is not where they are because they just know how to develop people. it's a competitive company. For me, like not being a patient person was like throwing a match on gasoline. So I appreciated that part of working in Toyota, like that. I guess a little bit of stress to excel, stress to like continuously improve. But particularly coming out of Toyota, like the world has varying types of individuals that contribute greatly in many ways. And I think having more patience for that, how to interact and how to best help organizations or help the people I work with to excel is something. If I was going back 30 years, I'd try to, it's a hard thing to teach, but I'd try to learn more how to be more patient with others. So I've learned that now, but I'm at the end of my career. So
well said.
That's an internal beast that I struggle with as well, Mark. So I can very much relate to, and I can very much appreciate that.
Well, the difficult outcome from that sometimes can be you push too quickly to get the answer you want and what you want. When in fact people have to find, and I'm not saying this is true to everyone. Most people want to find their pathway and want to solve the problem that's in front of them. I think how you nurture them along that is a really important part of a leader's role. And I would reflect on how over my career, how I've gotten better at that, but I didn't start out that way.
Yeah, definitely a balance, Mark. Because you need sometimes the problem solving to go at a faster pace than the individual's pace of learning. And I think what you've touched on is that the patience of being a good mentor, but still applying pressure so that we're not going at their pace, we're going at the pace needed for resolution, right? And I definitely appreciate that as well. I've grown more patient later in my career as well as early on. This has been great. I know, Mark, we appreciate your time. Again, what an amazing book. I told Lupe it really resonated with me because it took me back to my early learning about Toyota production system and Hoshin planning, and the fact that this book was so needed because the tools that are out there for this kind of planning really are so rooted in the tools, and you've got to be almost a sensei of the tool versus the process, right? And that's what I love about your book, really. And I'm encouraging others that I've met and know, and we're starting to use your book now within the organization we're with as well to help us refine our Hoshin planning process. Thank you for the book and the time today. Lupe, any other parting thoughts or comments from Mark?
Really resonated with me, Mark. I appreciate you for it and for your contribution to leaders out there and the world in general. But with that said, thank you. Hopefully in the future you'll join us again. We can continue to talk in some of these other topics that touch on this. But in the meantime, this is Lupe Munoz.
And I'm Steve McKeon, and our special guest, Mark Reich, joining us on the Leadership Exchange. Thank you.
And have a good day.